Shavua Tov, Chanukah Sameach. I want to talk right now about cooking in Sefer Bereshit, in the book of Genesis. And not just about cooking, but the idea of cooking food that's tasty, and why that is a theme that here and there actually seems to pop up a fair bit, and what the possible importance of that could be, and why it's not just some kind of mundane triviality. Because I think what we will be able to argue is that it's too consistent a theme for it to be something that we can dismiss as having nothing to do with the point of what the text is trying to say. But then we have to do some work to understand why that would be an important theme, because it sounds, as a preface, we might argue, like it's a bit of the wrong thing to focus on. And what do I mean by that? I think if you try to speak in broad themes of what the Torah is trying to teach Am Yisrael to exemplify in their own lives and actions, and more generally, therefore, to convey to humanity as a message, it is, something in the direction of what we learn, let's say, from the man, right? The manna from heaven, that man does not live by bread alone, right? That there is some kind of need to turn away from Egypt that we have, because Egypt was the place where we get fed well, and to remember that really it's the word of Hashem that sustains us, right? And that the things that people can get preoccupied with in this world when they forget Hashem, things like whether they're going to be fed or how well they're going to be fed, those are a kind of temptation to having the wrong priorities, which really is something we can trace all the way back to Gan Eden, right? The idea of eating the fruit that was forbidden, that carries a basic connotation of being unable to control your appetite, so to speak, that you should care more about obeying Hashem than you should about eating something that seems tasty to you. And learning that basic discipline is the beginning of morality at some level. And so it seems at the zeroth order, or sort of at the first level, like the message of how to serve Hashem properly is a message about learning discipline, learning self-restraint, and therefore setting some kind of boundary on hedonism or on gratifying yourself with the delightfulness of food that you might prepare. And so being too preoccupied with that kind of Epicureanism, is probably the wrong way to be. And maybe that's partly captured by the fact that the Talmudic sages, in their coining the term epikos as a word for a heretic, are trying to point out that way lies folly to a certain degree. And yet, I think at the same time, it's also interesting to note there are a lot of moments where the Avot and Imahot, the patriarchs and matriarchs, are preparing food. And it's not even just preparing food as a side note. Sometimes it is a bit of a side note, or, there are these psukim that are like vayas mishte, they made a feast. He made a feast, but it doesn't say, exactly what was being cooked. But while it's the case that in some of those examples, it doesn't say what's being cooked, there are plenty of other examples where you get specific information about what's being cooked. So let's think about some of them. For example, when the malachim or the visitors come to visit Avram and Sarah, before the birth of Yitzchak is foretold, it talks about the preparation of the meal, that it was the curds from the milk, and then also, presumably, if they were keeping the laws of kashrut, not in the same meal, but with some kind of separation, they've prepared a calf, and so at least you're getting some sense of the ingredients. And there's bread, so you get a sense of the different elements of the meal. That's still pretty basic, but there is a sense of they're trying to show hospitality, and they're trying to prepare a meal with proper components. And this gets much more developed when we go to the next generation with Yitzchak and Rivka, because there's this whole thing with, all right, first Yaakov makes a lentil stew, which he then gives to Esav in this exchange where he gets the firstborn status from Esav. And then Yitzchak and Rivka have this way that Yitzchak likes to have his food prepared, mita'amim, as the Torah describes. And that has to be the way that Esav prepares the game that he catches in order to get the blessing. And then Yaakov instead brings the prepared meal that his mother helped him to cook mita'amim, tastily in the way that Yitzchak likes, and that is part of what allows him to get the blessing. So there's a fulcrum or a sort of turning point in the plot that hinges on not just that there's food being provided, but that there's food being prepared in a specific way that produces a certain kind of enjoyment for the one eating it. And then it maybe seems like this is somewhat more muted in this back and forth between Yaakov and Esav with the lentil stew. We don't hear about other ingredients, but we at least are hearing about an ingredient. Like it's not just food or he made a banquet. It's telling us about a specific meal that has specific ingredients. But I think that the place that we maybe don't notice this theme continuing, but where we really maybe can start to understand where it's all leading, is in the life of Yosef. Because sometimes Yosef is described as having been sold as a slave into the house of the captain of Pharaoh's guards or something like that. For example, in this translation that I have here, it says, "V'hamidyanim machru oto el Mitzrayim leFotifar, Seris Paro, Sar HaTabachim." And the Midianites sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. But this phrase, Sar HaTabachim, if we just were, naive modern Hebrew speakers, and, I'm sure that when someone translates this as captain of the guard, there's some basis for this in the tradition. Maybe commentators have said that's what it means. But tabach in modern Hebrew means chef. And that's because the root of tavach or litvoach is about slaughtering an animal in order to cook it and prepare it, as a meal. And with that, we see elsewhere in the Torah itself. So, for example, if we look here in Bereshit, when Yosef is receiving his brothers, who don't know it's Yosef, as guests and having a meal for them, it says, "Vayar Yosef itam et Binyamin, vayomer le'asher al beito, have et ha'anashim habayta, utvoah tevah, ve'achen ki iti yochlu ha'anashim b'tzoraim." So this utvoah tevah, that is the same root as hatabachim, and when Yosef saw Binyamin with them, he said to the ruler of his house, "Bring these men home and slaughter a beast and make it ready, for these men shall dine with me." So it's not just kill an animal, but it's killing an animal to prepare it as a meal. And that notion, once we grab onto that really tabachim, from the beginning in the story with Yosef, when he's sold down as a slave to Egypt, he's in the house of Sarah Tabachim. That would not be the captain of the guard necessarily, but more like the captain of the cooks. And that sounds sort of silly, right? But then we realize, okay, what's the rest of the story that happens with Yosef? It's all about food, right? It's eventually going to be about how he feeds the whole country and how he tells Paro about there's going to be this shock to the food supply. But even before that, actually, he goes to prison, and in prison, he meets whom? He meets a baker and a winemaker. So, when you get thrown into prison, do you necessarily expect that the only people that you're going to meet in prison are going to be people who prepare food? That seems a little bit odd, right? I mean, we just take it as a matter of course because it's, oh, he so happened to meet them and that was how he got this connection to Paro. But it really makes much more sense than that because he was not just in any old prison, he was in the prison of the house of Sarah Tabachim. That's something we find out later, right? So at the point where Yosef is being presented to Paro, or rather is being described to Paro by Sarah Mashkim, the vintner or whatever you want to call him, he says to Paro, the vintner does, Paro katzaf al avdo weiten oti bamishmar bet sar hatabahim oti ve'et sar haofim. So Paro was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the captain of the guard's house, as it's translated in this translation, both me and the chief baker. But the point is that this guy is, it's not that Yosef went into a general prison system for having done something in Mitzrayim, that it says, Veitenoti b'mishmar beit Sarah Tabahim. So he was under guard in the house of Sarah Tabachim. And if that's the case, then there really was kind of like a prison for lack of a better description, it's like a prison for chefs. But it wasn't a prison for chefs. It was a jail for people who had been working in the house of Sarah Tabachim. And Sarah Tabachim, I would want to argue, maybe is the head chef for Paro. And the point is that this is not, we shouldn't think of it like a chef in the modern sense. We should think of it more like Paro is a god king. Paro has a court. Paro has a lot of needs in terms of preparation of fine food for his courtiers and distribution of food for him and for his courtiers. So there's a whole economy around this, and that has to be managed by some kind of minister that's running the whole show. And the point is that's a large enough economy within the city, or the capital, or however you want to describe the situation where Paro is set up, his palace, whatever, that they have their own jail, so to speak. And it's not, for comedic reasons, it's just like, this is, you could imagine there would be like a small city of people who were just responsible for preparing the food for Paro's palace and the food for Paro's court. And so then, when they break a rule, Yosef is a servant of Sarah Tabachim in his house. And even it talks about that he liked Yosef. Why? Because of the bread in his mouth, right? Which at the time we don't notice. It's just, oh yeah, Yosef is good at making sure that everything goes smoothly in Potiphar's house, so he likes him, and that's expressed by the fact that he didn't care. Potiphar didn't care about anything but the bread that was in his mouth. But now you start to think, oh, he's Sarah Tabachim. He cares about producing food, and Yosef was contributing to that, and that's what made him successful there. So then, if you get in trouble, Yosef is a servant in that house. He goes to the Beit Soar, right, the jail, but it's the jail in the house of Sarah Tabachim. And when the other people that we're talking about here also get in trouble, such as the baker or the vintner, they're going to end up in a similar situation, right? And that's how Yosef meets them. So maybe it isn't so shocking in the end that Yosef meets other people who are involved in the preparation of food in his time when he's locked up, because it might really be the case that he is locked up only with other people who work, in some capacity in the economy of Sarah Tabachim's, city meant to produce food for Paro's court. Or, this is all a speculation, but we're kind of filling in the blanks here. So, we can run with this idea a little bit, because I think it makes the point that we're looking to turn over pretty simply, and that's, it's not a complicated thesis, but I think just to summarize what we're claiming from start to finish, I think the idea is that actually there's a pretty consistent theme from generation to generation with the avot of not just the importance of having food or being able to make food edible, but even like having some skill in the preparation of food. And that we see that most acutely important in the story of Yosef because it's part of what makes Yosef successful. He's not just a slave in Egypt with some random job. He's a slave working in a place where it's about producing food for the court of Paro, and doing that well is a matter of life or death, as we see in the examples of Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Ofim, the baker and the vintner, because one of them messes up but is restored to Paro's side after being put in prison, and the other one messes up and then is killed. And so there's a real sense of high stakes in the performance of this job, but also ultimately that if we're trying to understand Yosef's rise and his success, he eventually is going to Paro and talking to Paro about food. He understands something about the food economy of Mitzrayim that he's already kind of learned on the job by looking at the supply of grain and wondering how much bread they're going to be able to produce from one day or month or year to the next. And so the whole story with Yosef is about his being a successful producer of food. And we now can see his success both before he runs afoul of Potiphar with his scandal with Potiphar's wife, and afterwards, as being partly connected with possibly some skill that he has or some aptitude he has for figuring out how to make a lot of good food, right? Because that is his job. And if he's succeeding, as the Torah tells us he is, then in some sense we know that that's because he's figured out how to be good at that, or he has skills that are relevant to that job. And that actually maybe shouldn't shock us so much, because if we look for another mention of this this root that we were arguing is, it's from Tabachim. It's also when Yosef has the animal prepared for a tasty meal for his brothers. It appears the first appearance of that root in the Torah actually is at this moment where it's after the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, and there's this communication sent to Avram Avinu telling him, oh, actually, it turns out you have some news from your relatives back in the East, and there is this daughter of Betuel named Rivka, and she exists. And so it's a setup for Parshat Chai Sarah and sending Eliezer over to find Rivka in Padan Aram and bring her to Avram so that she can marry Yitzchak. But the point is that when it's listing all the different children of Betuel and other people in this family of Nachor, one of the people mentioned, it says, Ufilagsho ushmah reuma wateled gam hi et tevah ve'et geham ve'et thahash ve'et ma'acha. So, and his concubine, whose name was Ruma, she bore Tevach and Gaham and Tachash and Ma'acha. And interestingly, Lavan is not mentioned anywhere here, or if he is, it's because he is mentioned by some other name. But he should be, since he's a brother of Rivka. But Rivka is mentioned explicitly, and also someone named Tevach. And I think the point with the only claim I want to make in this mention of Tevach is, again, it's without the vowels. You might have read it in modern Hebrew as Tabach, that it's a chef. And the only point, I think, is to say that Rivka comes from a family where someone is named chef, or someone is named about food preparation, and this root that sort of connotes careful preparation of food so that it's tasty. And isn't it interesting that of anyone who is then portrayed in the Torah as explicitly having skilled in preparing food that is tasty, it's Rivka Imenu, right? Rivka Imenu is the one who knows how to prepare food so that that's the way that Yitzchak Avinu likes it, and that, as we said before, plays a key role in this moment with Yitzchak testing Yaakov and Esav. So we can come to exactly what Yitzchak is doing there in due course, but I think that the main first thing to say is, okay, there is such a thing in the Torah as the idea of being good at preparing tasty food. And we might have thought from Eden, we might have thought from the problem of being too concerned with eating something that looks good, even if it's forbidden to you, and maybe with a general sense of we're supposed to be about relating to Hashem and his laws and not be concerned with our own gustatory pleasures or with the material, and we should be elevating ourselves with the spiritual, or all these kind of inclinations people have to talk in certain terms, some of which I think when people talk about it in a Jewish context, it goes overboard and starts sounding more Christian or Islamic sometimes, like the possibility of asceticism where you eschew worldly pleasures and all of that. But there is a strain that's legitimate that we get from Tanakh, because if someone goes overboard with that, it seems like it's a problem. So, we might have thought that you're not supposed to care about how your food tastes. You're supposed to just eat it to stay alive and then go and do good deeds and keep the Torah. And what does it matter how it tastes, right? That is not, the simple story that we can run with here, though, because it seems that actually knowing how to cook things that are tasty is a pretty significant theme as we run down through the lives of the Avot and Imahot. And specifically Rivka, it's an especially important one. But this because we have this word tabach or tavach or tevach or however you want to however you want to pronounce it, that connects, starting with Rivka, down through the story with Yaakov and Esav, and then eventually it reappears in the life of Yosef explicitly, when Yosef's career and survival in Mitzrayim is really all about his ability to seemingly produce tasty food. And we know that he's operating and succeeding in a condition where the difference between producing tasty food and not is a matter of life and death. And it ultimately brings him, one step below the throne of Paro, where he's making sure to feed the entire country. So there is a real sense of importance of this kind of skill in the text, and that the Torah seems not to want to or seems to want us not to become kind of anti-materialist and reject the possibility of seeking enjoyment of food that we eat. We can't go to that extreme. And so, yeah, I think it's easier to argue that it's there in the text. And now the question is why, and what could the lesson be? And there, I'm not sure I have as strong a statement to make, but I think that maybe it's instructive now to look at the case of Rivka and Yitzchak and Yaakov and Esav in order to get a bit of a hint at that. I think there's two kind of aspects to this. One is clearly that being a chef is also kind of like being a priest, like a kohen. The kohanim ultimately are going to be operating in the mikdash, where they are preparing food on the mizbeach, on the altar, and they have to do that well as a matter of performing their duties as kohanim properly. Now, that's a complicated statement to make, because doing it well doesn't mean being creative and constantly adding new ingredients and doing it more this way or more that way, as though there are a lot of parameters that are supposed to channel their creativity. On the contrary, the Kohanim are not supposed to be very creative. They're supposed to be pretty rigidly constrained by halacha, because the point ultimately of the sacrificial meat is not principally hedonism. It's about relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, on the one hand. On the other hand, it is supposed to be a tasty meal. And once you get to a certain level in the discussion of details in halacha, there are questions of how should sacrificial meat be eaten. I think that Rav Grossman has done some very interesting previous shiurim about that around Korban Pesach and other cases of eating sacrificial meat, where it's like, oh, should you eat it with greens? Should you eat it with mustard? Like that. You can ask that question because it is a meal at the end of the day, and so it is at one level relevant. And you even maybe see that hinted at in the Torah, in the sense that ultimately when Yosef is restored to good standing and he comes out of prison, he is being he is offered a daughter. Sorry, he is offered as a wife a daughter of a priest of On, according to the Torah. It says, "Uli-Yosef yulad shnei vanim beterem tavo shenat hara'av asher yolda lo Osnat bat Potifera Kohen On." Right? So Osnat is his wife. She's the daughter of Potifera, who is the Kohen of On. Now, Potifera sounds a lot like Potifar. And when we were told about who Potifar was before, he was Sarah Tabachim. He was like the head chef. Now, Potifera, it splits Potifar into a Poti and then Fera, which looks like Paro. So it's like, it has an ayin now. So it sounds more like Pharaoh. And he's not head chef. He's Kohen of On. So he's now a priest. And I think that's why the name has to be different, because the Torah is saying, look, is he just a head chef, or is the head chef for Paro really more sort of like a high priest? Because eating food is not just something we do to stay alive, and it's not even just something we do to delight in tastes. It's something that ultimately can contain ritual, can give us an elevated experience, and so the boundary can be very blurred between who is a chef and who is a priest. And the Torah is already kind of pointing that out to us, perhaps with this tampering with the name of Potiphar and the reassignment of his profession. So, there is an aspect of everything to do with preparation of food that we see with the Avot and Imaot, where it's all kind of foreshadowing the temple and foreshadowing that the kihuna will involve preparation of food that is to be eaten before Hashem, or that is for Hashem. And, that makes sense because the Avot and Imahot are the parents of Mamlechet Kohanim, the nation of priests. And so to the degree that Am Yisrael as a whole is supposed to be a priestly nation, they should be descended from people who have these kind of priestly qualities, even, before the tribes. It's like they all have a bit of Levi in them, or they all have a bit of Kohen in them. And to the degree that's the case, then they're going to be preparing food in a way that has a sacrificial aspect to it. And I think you see that certainly in the example of this instance with Yitzchak and the meal that's being prepared for him, where he's going to give a blessing because he's properly fed. So there's this element of pantomiming the sort of structure of a pagan transaction where you sort of give a sacrifice to a god and then the god gives you a blessing. And so there is that aspect to it, but I don't think you could even necessarily say that fully covers it, because at the same time, I think also, as much as we may see the kihuna, the priesthood, in the background of what, let's say, Yitzchak and Rivka and Esav and Yaakov are doing in that story about the blessing and about this meal that leads to the blessing, it doesn't really work to say it's all about that, because these are, at the end of the day, not Kohanim. They're people in a generation where they don't have a nation. They just have a family. And still, there is an importance to the quality of, the way that the meal is being prepared, that has to make sense in that context. It can't only make sense in a metaphorical or sort of representational context where we anticipate the kihuna. So then I think we have to be able to ask, well, why does Yitzchak care so much about this meal? And is he just this unrestrained hedonist? Like, it sounds so disturbing and odd that he seems to be making this very consequential decision about how he's going to relate to his sons going forward and how he's going to perhaps help them or guide them to different kind of roles on the basis of who can make a meal that's very tasty for him, because he just is so ruled by his appetites that whoever will, provide for him in the right way gets the prize. It can't be that, right? If Yitzchak Avinu is one of the avot, if he's a great tzaddik with a great relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who's going to be the beginning of a nation based on Torah, it doesn't make sense that he's just this sort of, debauched, blind epicure who just wants a great meal and then, he'll give out the Michelin stars and the blessings. It can't be that that's, what's going on there. And I think that the alternative that is maybe somewhat obvious is that he cares about the skill, right? So that's coming back to this other question of, is this something that matters, right? He thinks that it makes a difference to the future flourishing of the nation that will come from a son of his, depending on whether or not there is this skill, the ability to prepare the meal in a way that's tasty. And let's say, it has to be judged by him as the one who's eating it. So of course it should matter how he wants it to taste. And I think maybe that's also the point, is like the ability to cater to a customer to some degree. And you have to think of this in broader terms and say, you're creating something, and you're creating something that's going to have value to someone else. And it's both about the ability to produce things of value to other people, and also about being sensitive to their particular wants and needs, and make things that are especially of value to them because you've understood what they like and you've figured out how to accommodate those desires, right? So you kind of have to generalize it. It's not just, I think, at the end of the day, about food. It, of course, is basically about food, because a big part of a nation's success is about being able to provide for living, and surviving in a world that, especially back then, had a lot less food in it. But I think you can go beyond that and say, this is actually about the idea of having skills that allow you to succeed in an economy where you have a kind of a customer or a consumer, and being able to adapt yourself to those demands. And I think the reason that you would worry that that wasn't necessarily a skill that was going to naturally come into being in this nation is because this nation is supposed to be about what Hashem wants, right? That's the whole point. We're creating this this nation of priests, this Mamlechet Kohanim, where it's about the Torah, and the Torah is about what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. And so that could engender in someone the attitude of, well, I don't care how you like your meal to be prepared. I'm just going to follow Hashem's rules. And I'm indifferent to what you desire because I desire what Hashem desires. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Yitzchak Avinu, through his understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I think might say to that, well, but what if what I want you to do is to show sensitivity to the desires of other people, right? Like, the point of serving Hashem is not to forget about other people and to be blind to who they are and what they need and what they want, but rather that we can serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu well, sometimes by understanding that and by noticing those things and perhaps factoring them into how we act. And so if we look at what Yitzchak Avinu is doing, he either is providing one or another kind of test for Esav. I think previously, when we've said that when he asks for the food to be prepared mita'amim, like with the flavorings or the manner of preparation that I like, uh, he he either is saying, I mean, one way of looking at it is to say he knows that Rivka can do that she has that skill, and he wants Esav to get his mother's backing for the blessing, and that's actually a challenge for Esav. So that's one way of reading it. I think that in other shiurim we've discussed previously, and that's a different kind of test. That's more like Yitzchak creating a challenge for Esav in family politics, because Yitzchak maybe knows that Esav doesn't by default have Rivka's backing, and he has to convince her somehow. And that isn't what ends up happening, right? But alternatively, it could also just be saying, look, the side, the game that Yaakov hunts, that Esav hunts, it's good food, it's nourishing, but there's also an aspect of being sensitive to the desires of other people beyond the basic provision of what they need, and being able to adapt what you provide in a way that shows sensitivity to the other person. And there's maybe even a suggestion of that because this word tzayid, which is game that he hunts, at one point in that passage is written in the Torah as tzedah. So it's like provision instead of game, meaning it's just like the point is it's food. So it's about calories. But when you view in those terms, it kind of sounds like, okay, so it's not about how tasty it is. So that may have been an issue that Esav had to get over. And Yitzchak was presenting a challenge to Esav to say, look, you need to show me that this isn't just about calories and that it's also about a sort of a subtler sensitivity to the possibilities of giving a person what would make them happy, and then realizing that there's kind of a complexity to that or a subtlety to that, and that ultimately, I think we can at least see from the text plays out as, why would Yitzchak care about this? He cares about it because that's part of how you succeed and survive in the world. And you look at it and you see it with Yosef that it's clear as day that this skill, this tabach skill that starts with Rivka explicitly and being described when Rivka is first introduced, and then rears its head in the life of Yosef, he's able to flourish in Mitzrayim and succeed, not just because he can sort of do the minimum and moving food around from A to B, but because perhaps he has skill that allows him to help to produce something that is, worthy, fit for a king, like that it can go on Paro's plate. And that's what everyone in Sarah Tabachim's organization is trying to do, as we see with Sarah Mashkim and Sarofim, and Yosef can flourish in that environment because he has that skill. And so I think that in the end we could say, we can abstract this a little bit and say, ultimately, this isn't just about food. This is about who Am Yisrael are supposed to be as they become a nation and how we're supposed to flourish and succeed. And you might have naively thought that the answer would be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't care whether we have skills because he wants us to be moral and he wants us to be righteous. And if we do those things, then he will open every stuck door with miracles for us. And so if we're kind of phoning it in terms of our economic productivity, in terms of what we're creating for the people that we're transacting with in the world, which is, very much going to include the other nations of the world, so to speak, whoever it is, that you might have imagined you could phone that part in and say, well, look, I'm giving you a meal, so you can't complain. Maybe it's not the most delicious meal you've ever had, but I'm going to be fine because Hakadosh Baruch Hu will sprinkle miracles all over the place in my life because I'm so righteous. And then it doesn't matter that I kind of gave you a mediocre meal, so to speak. But no, what the Avot care about, and even it seems ultimately in the arc of the Torah and its narrative, what it's showing us is that uh, having the skill to provide your trading partner with exactly what they want or something that is especially desirable to them, that is part of flourishing in the world. And you shouldn't uh, refrain from desiring to develop those skills because it's somehow is ingratiating yourself too much in the wrong way, or um, subjecting yourself too much to the wrong standards. Now, clearly, there's another extreme that you have to avoid, which is that there are people where they make an idol out of just trying to find means of gratifying themselves, or in succeeding in creating things that other people like, and they end up just worshiping or being subject to the whims of their customers or their kings or whoever it is that they're trying to please. And ultimately, it is true that we shouldn't lose sight that we're trying to make Hakadosh Baruch Hu happy. But I think what Hakadosh Baruch Hu, it seems, would not want is for us to think that because we're making him happy, that we don't need the skill to do exceptionally well at pleasing people in this world, because actually doing what Hashem wants can involve developing great skill and then deploying it for the benefit of people in this world. And as long as we think of it in those terms, it's better to have those skills. So it's not a kind of a it's an issue of it's a feature and not a bug. That's, I think sometimes people might look at Jewish history and say, well, it's true that Jews throughout the ages have found ways of flourishing and succeeding, and that's because they figured out what people wanted. They developed really applicable and useful skills for the economies that they were a part of, and they got very rich sometimes. Not always. Lots of Jews were poor throughout the ages, but lots of Jews were able to succeed because they figured out what people really wanted, and they developed really good skills for giving people what they wanted, and they had that kind of successful transaction with the world around them. And you might say, well, that's nice, but maybe that's kind of a failure mode of Jewishness, where we take the sort of genius we should be applying to Talmud Torah and serving Hashem, and we end up using it to kind of thrive and survive and succeed. And that's a cultural theme, or a strong strain within the culture, but it is one that ideally, when we're done fully turning to Hashem and devoting ourselves to Torah, that we would kind of forget and leave behind. But I don't think that we quite can say that. What we instead are meant to say is, like, yes, you don't want to ultimately be a slave to Paro. You don't want to ultimately serve a customer or a king instead of Hashem. But if you are serving Hashem properly, that having the capacity to develop high quality skills, or the ability, the skills that are needed to produce and create things that are high in quality, ultimately that's something that they were trying to build into the nation from the beginning by bringing Rivka into the nation, for example. That's something that the Avot cared about, and it's something that we should care about, both because ultimately it will make us better as Kohanim, and we can better perform our duties in the explicit service of Hashem according to the Torah, and also because having the skills to do more for each other and for humanity as a whole is part of being more effective of Dei Hashem, if we apply it with the right kavanah, or the right attitude.